G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and you're also having a fantastic midweek. Now legends, you know that I'm on my 4th day of chemotherapy and I am deteriorating somewhat. I'm feeling worse and worse and I'm about to go in and get some more IV fluids and drugs. So hopefully we can get through the next couple of days as smooth as possible. Now legends, as always, we have a lot to go over. And as I'm in my own war of attrition, well, it makes sense to talk about attritional war, as the similarities are striking. You take a drug that is killing you slowly but trying to kill something else more quickly, but both are working their way down. So we'll talk about that at length and why this obsession over numbers is always at the forefront of conscious in the propaganda informational space. We need to look at what Trump's view of the war really is. And I think that gets skewed a lot. Many see it as that he is completely throwing Ukraine under the bus and abandoning it. But there is a lens you can put it through and say where maybe he's actually trying to save it as well, given the way he believes it's going. We need to talk about any deal at this point in time would likely be, quote, an ugly deal. But at the end of the day, if you want an end to the war, we need to look at the realities rather than the ideals. And of course, we'll be then looking at the maps, comparing maps, a couple of geolocations, as well as over a few days and grey zone shifts we need to talk about as well. So there's always a lot. Now, we'll get into the maps in the middle of the video. I want to start with Trump and an interview that he has had. Now, I think many people actually underestimate the amount of power that the US has in international affairs, foreign relations. They are the most powerful country in the world militarily and economically. Yes, China is catching them very, very quickly, but America's real power is in the dollar and allies as well. Where China doesn't have any formal military alliances, they're more very independent, wanting their own path, which can be a power of itself. But I think many people think other states are on the level of America when they say something, and that just isn't the case. One of the big problems with the EU is that Estonia or Lithuania in voting have the same as a behemoth like Germany that is many, many factors times larger. So it does really matter what the leader of the US says. Now, in this interview, he's asked that, let me ask you, because the portrait of Ronald Reagan is sitting above your shoulder. For 100 years, American presidents have innately sympathised with smaller nations and peoples that had been bullied or oppressed by Russia. You don't seem to have the same innate sympathy. It's not just Ronald Reagan, it's Jimmy Carter, JFK and so on. Why don't you seem to have that same feeling for these bullied, oppressed nations that every other American president has had? And Trump says, well, I think I do. I think I'm saving that nation. I think that nation will be crushed very shortly. It's a big war machine. Let's face it. Now, this is what I've said before about Trump's mindset. In my opinion, Trump is seeing that from here, all we're going to do is cross event horizons where Ukraine will cease to exist. And that in his mind, he's going, I can save 80% of the territory and the remaining population, but there has to be sacrifice made, or we can gamble with both the territory and population, but the war machine of Russia will march on and likely, or as he may see, an event horizon being crossed, where then it will get worse. That is the way Trump is seeing it. And I believe in history, Trump will go down however he will go down, but I think with this war, it may be seen in history in decades' time, he was trying to save it more than actually abandon it. Again, it all matters the lenses you actually view this through. And I really implore people not just to look through whatever coloured glasses, whether it be red, white and blue or blue and yellow or whatever, just to try and see things from maybe a different perspective. If you actually want to be able to analyse how someone is viewing something. He goes on about him delivering lethal aid to Ukraine. Now, I could make the case that it's too bad that it went on because a lot of people have died. A lot more people died in that war than is being reported. We know that. Not just soldiers. It's a lot of soldiers, but there's a lot of other people too. And I really can make the case that I've been very good because I'm saving that country. The Prime Minister of Norway, a very respected guy, says that if Trump didn't get involved, this war would never end. I think I'm doing a great service to Ukraine, and I believe it. Exactly like I have expressed. That's how Trump sees it. And I think that history may show that is the correct way at this point. Think of this. If Harris had won and the slow drip feed of weapons continued coming in, would this equal or amass to a win for Ukraine, or would it just continue that losing more slowly and much, much larger losses? And I think Trump, love him or hate him, is willing to make some very, very difficult decisions. And he says the Ukrainians don't believe that, though. Trump says, well, they don't because they have pretty good publicity. Look, the war in Ukraine would have never happened if I were president. It would never have happened, and it didn't happen for 4 years. So again, usual rhetoric about it would never have happened, but he also touches on this. They have very good publicity about the belief that ultimately Russia's war machine will take over and maybe even the cessation of the state. Now, this is the thing, is neither the Ukrainians or Europeans believe that they will be crushed. I mean, the European leadership looking at Ukraine. Now, I agree with that they believe this, but what exactly do they believe? Because from my experience, they also don't en masse actually believe that Ukrainian tanks will roll through Sevastopol. I don't know where that belief is. Yes, they are fully believing that they won't be crushed. They're likely right on that too. But they also don't fully believe the Crimean Beach Party like some online would like to suggest that they do, at least from my experience talking to a lot of people. And there's many bloggers behind the scenes that really only say these for audience capture, AdSense money. It trends well with that audience. So what is actually the belief there? What is being shaped in this? And I want to say Ukraine has run an unbelievably successful information campaign. It's gone from being seen as a poor, corrupt, highly conservative religious country to a rich, safe, progressive nation. But also in this information, it is now being seen as one that can defeat Russia on the battlefield. Now, this has created a pseudo-environment in which, for many, this is now true. And these decisions are getting made off that truth and influencing that. And we'll look at some historical elements in a second about the pseudo-environment developing a true. But I don't know where people believe, because I think if you stop the average person on the street in Ukraine and you asked, is Russia about to crush you? They would say no, but do you believe in your heart of hearts that the Crimea, Sevastopol are coming back? I think they'll also say no. So what I say in this is maybe Trump's right, having some middle ground and saying, look, we need to draw a line down here. It may not be ethical or moral, but what I say is what is right doesn't come into factor when you've got a gun pointed at your head in an attritional war, which by, I think, all measures is being lost. Now, we see this between Mr. Charlie Kirk and J.D. Vance in an interview here before I move on to something about attritional war and losses. Now, funnily, this interview had like 60,000 views, so I'm like, damn, maybe I'm big enough to get Mr. Vance on the phone. But I wanted to talk again about this. I know I shared it yesterday, but I think many are missing the core facts of the state that this war is actually in and its attritional nature. So a couple of quotes here. Attritional war is the slow execution of a state, grinding down its men, means, and morale until it can no longer stand, let alone fight. You don't win an attritional war by outmaneuvering them. You bury them under their weight of their own losses until surrender is mercy and survival is uncertain. And this is the sort of war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, and by all factors that I've seen, is currently winning that. And I believe Trump and Vance, two of the biggest actors in this, they also believe that. Because he has said on the Charlie Kirk show, I can't say with 100% certainty that we're going to be able to do a peace deal. He didn't discuss the details of the proposed peace agreements, but he did say he believes Ukraine will not be able to defeat Russia militarily and take back occupied territories by force. Zelensky has said that as well. He said if this doesn't stop, the Ukrainians aren't winning the war. I think there's this weird idea among the mainstream media that if this thing goes on for just another few years, the Russians will collapse, the Ukrainians will take their territory back, and everything will go back to the way it was before the war. That is not the reality that we live in. Vance said that if the war drags on, Russia and Ukraine would both face societal collapse. Millions more lives could be lost, and the risk of nuclear war could escalate. It has to stop. It is the policy of this administration that it stops. Now, many people take these here as just somewhat propaganda, speculation, but this is real too. And I've said I don't think they're going to exit this war without 1 million people dead. And that can include maybe double that in post-war attrition as well, depending how this actually ends. For my belief, we're probably at 250,000 dead of soldiers at this point in time. But we also need to look at the amount of post-war then emigration, what Russia may gain as far as population, what Russia has lost, what Ukraine has lost in population through KIA, MIA, stuck behind lines, emigration, all of that. But also that this societal collapse, this then increases that nuclear threat absolutely dramatically. And I've spoken a lot about Ukraine and attritional war, but we also need to remember there are two factors going in here. Russia is also waging attritional war. And we must remember that the goal of attritional war, it isn't outright victory. It's to make your enemy fail faster than you. You are still losing, just more slowly. Okay, so think about my treatment at the moment. I'm still losing, but we're just trying to lose Willie less quickly than Mr. Willie Tumour. Okay. Now, I'm open and invite any rational counter-argument to the point that Ukraine is winning the attritional war. Yet I'm to hear anything that is rational instead of using just numbers which are plucked out of the air, and I'll show you why they're plucked out of the air. I'm open to any of that, but by all the figures I've seen, adding then any objective stance, Russia is winning the attritional war. I showed this even using Zelensky's figures. Zelensky presented figures and I said even this, which is highly inflated and deflated, that still shows that as far as men, Russia is winning the attritional war. Now, that said, Russia is taking heavy losses. And for Putin, this war, it must end with territorial gains for him. He can't now walk out. Now, these territories that he wants, they have trillions of dollars in resources and they are home to millions of people. And this can serve as a demographic and economic buffer in the post-war attritional phase. But of course, one side loses that, one side gains it, depending where that border ends up. Now, this, of course, this loss of people, loss of economic power because you're launching an attritional war. Remember, you were still losing, just trying to do it more slowly. This does create strategic vulnerability, and absorbing and sustaining losses and then frontline gains under sanctions has deepened Russia's dependence on China. And that this is the paradox the US is in, that we want to weaken Russia, but not to the point where it becomes a de facto extension of China's industrial machine. That's the paradox. You're not willing to push that hard that it becomes so reliant on China and therefore strengthens China further and further drives China's ambitions of de-dollarization. Now, we overestimate, well, not we here, but many, I believe many, actually overestimate the Chinese-Russian relationship. We need to remember that these great states, they don't have permanent friends or enemies. They have strategic ambition and relationship. And I think Putin could potentially fall into that column for Xi Jinping. Now, we talk a lot about attritional warfare and informational there. And what we get every single day, and it tends to be the same around figures every day, is this from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense of the Russian losses. And I was reading something the other day that really explained why this is in war and why Ukraine is leaning so heavily on presenting these losses every single day, given the informational style warfare. And of course, we have called out these numbers before for not being reflective of information you could actually gather and likely of reality. But I wanted to go over a part in this book that really does talk about that well. And I think this was back in the early 20th century, referring to World War I, France and Germany, but you can relate this to those numbers unbelievably. Now, there is counterfaction about the competence of the officers. Instead, therefore, of letting the public act on all the facts which the generals knew, the authorities presented only certain facts, and these only in such a way as would be most likely to steady the people. In this case, the men who arranged the pseudo-environment knew what the real one was. So you're presenting some facts, but the way you want it to be seen. So are there losses? Yes. You inflate that. You present only, though, then one side of the losses as well. Don't worry, it's going to make sense in a second. The editor of the French communiqué tells us that as the battle dragged out, his colleagues and he set out to neutralise the tenacity of the Germans by continual insistence on their terrible losses. It is necessary to remember that at this time, until late 1917, the orthodox view of the war for all Allied peoples was that it would be decided by attrition. Nobody believed in a war of movement. It was insisted that the strategy did not count. Diplomacy, it would simply be a matter of killing Germans. The general public more or less believed dogma, but it had constantly to be reminded of it in the face of spectacular German successes. So as you're being successes, you need to present this of no, but the attrition is so high. Okay? Almost no day passed, but the communiqué ascribed to the Germans with some appearance of just as heavy losses, extremely heavy. Spoke of bloody sacrifices, heaps of corpses, head of tombs. Likewise, the wires constantly used the statistics of the Intelligence Bureau at Verdun, whose chief, Major Contet, had invented a method of calculating German losses which obviously produced marvellous results. Every fortnight, the figures increased 100,000 or so, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 casualties put out, divided into a daily, weekly, monthly losses, repeated in all sorts of ways, produced a striking effect. Okay, so it's producing this pseudo-environment that you would like, and people are taking this in and believing it. Why? That we see each day under the artillery, machine gun fire, mowed down by artillery and machine gun fire. The constant repetition impressed the neutrals and Germany itself. The thesis of the French command, which it wished to establish publicly by these reports, was formulated as follows for the guidance of the census. This offensive engages the active forces of our opponent, whose manpower is declining. We have learned that the class of 1916 is already at the front, and there will remain the 1917 class already being called up and the resources of the third category, men above 45 or convalescents. In a few weeks, the German forces will be exhausted by this effort, will find themselves confronted with the forces of the coalition, 10 million against 7 million. Remember, we have heard very similar to this before about, the army's gone, all we're going to see is randoms from Siberia somewhere on the front line. Again, this is informational war. It makes sense, but we need to put perspective on it. The French command had converted itself to this belief. By an extraordinary aberration of mind, only the attrition of the enemy was seen. It appeared that our forces were not subject to attrition. And this is what I see, that it appears, if you are in NAFO or even in this, that there is no real attrition to be seen, at least of high figures on then your side. You only see Russia apparently dying in the hundreds of thousands. What can happen is then this doesn't get taken into account at those making the decisions. We have learned to call this propaganda. The casualty figures of Major Content, which were spread about the world, are of the same order. They were intended to provoke a particular kind of inference, namely that the war of attrition was going in favour of the French, therefore creating a pseudo-environment of truth, that people believed all this to be true because of the pseudo-environment then created. It results almost automatically from the creation of a mental picture of endless Germans slaughtered on the hill of Verdun. See the mental picture we have that numbers like this have created? Or by then pages and the Ukrainian military only showing attacks of significant losses creates that environment and that mental picture of then just endless slaughtering on the grounds. By putting the dead Germans in the focus of the picture and by omitting to mention the French dead, a very special view of the battle was built up. It was a view designed to neutralize the effects of German territorial advances and the impression of power which the persistence of the offensive was making. Here we go. So it neutralizes the effects of territorial advances. And what we see in this right here, these numbers, these are neutralizing the effects of Russian territorial advances with just but the cost is ever so great. It was also a view that tended to make the public accept in the demoralizing defensive strategy imposed upon Allied armies. For the public, accustomed to the idea that war consisted of great strategic movements, flank attacks, encirclements, and dramatic surrenders, had to gradually forget that picture in favour of the terrible idea that matching lives the war would be won. And this in here is very, very important of what this is showing us. For the public who are accustomed to great strategic manoeuvre warfare, what this is then changing the idea in that sort of environment is, but there's so many losses only being taken on one side. The obsession with showing then these losses as well, that creates the environment of complete winning of attritional war. Now, I will say in this, please ignore all my messy handwriting and whatever else. I read these on the move, and it's not great. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense in that. Now, let's have a look at the maps before we talk about ugly deals. Here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, purple since 14, the red check ground Russia has made over the past 24 or 48 hours. We had 2 map updates yesterday, and I only got the first one. Now, where I want to come first is then into Kursk, because I believe this is very, very important. Now, let's have a look on the map today. And then we go back to yesterday, and we can see from Zurivka, Vasilivka, Basivka, we can see then a large Russian advancement in these directions. If we measure from the border to here, we're talking maybe 5.5 kilometers, or then out from Basivka towards Lokhnia as well. Now, this is very, very important. This control back into Sumy that is now well outmatching the amount of Ukrainian-controlled territory in Kursk. Ukraine is going to have to tie forces up in here to keep the Russians at bay, and that is only going to mean pulling guys away from the east at this point in time. Now, let's have a look at this. Remember, I showed you this the other day. This is the location of where those Russian motorcycles hit a mine, taking out both of them. But remember, like I just presented in attritional warfare, you are only showed failed assaults. This is on purpose, but no one, I guess, ever wonders why the front keeps moving. We saw the failed assault in here, but then we see the front move. So obviously there have been successful movements in here as well, as we see this moving here. So by only showing that, you create that pseudo environment, that picture. Now, I'm not blaming anyone for doing this. It makes complete sense. But us trying to analyze the war, we need to try and see through this as well. And we see this is the Syriac map. Now, he is showing basically the grey zone of the deep state. He's showing as red, but further down to Lokhnia, as well as recovery of more territory in Kursk as well. So very, very similar, saying that this area in here has basically then been recovered. Apologies, incorrect. This area down in here basically getting recovered, as well as further pushes to this red dot, which is Lokhnia. Keep an eye on this. We could see large movements in here, buffer zones. We saw Sir Gerasimov talking to Putin about specifically doing this. Now, let's move our way down the map, and we have to then go back to yesterday's map, turn this on so we can get the red check that we'll see around Pokrovsk. Now, these red lines, don't worry about it. I believe that is just map corrections or whatever, but we see this movement here in the direction of Bahatsar Rozliv frontline, confirming Russian movement in that direction. And if we then bring up this by the Syriac map, same general direction. He's just showing that it's not out in prongs. Realistically, it probably started like that and then expands. But this is all in the direction of this Bahatsar front. So what I've seen is then, as per Russians' typical sort of paint by numbers tactic, what we see here is a claimed Fab 3000. I think it's probably a Fab 1500. It just seems like everything's now a Fab 3000. But this is a very, very large explosion here in Bahatar, right in the center. The actual geolocation doesn't really matter. But what we're seeing, that paint by numbers of the Fabs landing on this area, I think in the coming days, and if I miss it, please let me know, what we will see is some level of MLRS, whether it be a TOS 123 or a grad on Bahatar, and then we'll see motorcycle elements, then armoured elements as this moves then forwards. Now, there was another small update on this map near Vilny Pole as well, just advancing here, entering the town. So just where this grey zone is moving, but further out in that direction. Now, we need to keep this open on this day because we see Uspenivka coming under control of the Russian forces, as well as Kotlyrivka as well on the Pokrovsk front. And this is really going in line with the Suryak maps, of course, showing Uspenivka and this area here. Look, pretty happy with those, are very, very close, but an expansion of control out through Shevchenko in this direction as well. This is Novi Trud, this is Shevchenko, so in between these two. And a slight movement. Oh, sorry if I can move this. Sorry, this map gets a bit stuck occasionally. And more of a movement through Lysivkia according to then Suryak maps as well. So definite movements around this area. And then let's go forward in a day, turn this back on, and then we can see further movements. Rozliv, Constantinople, this area then confirmed, filling in by the Russian forces. I'm guessing this is going to be about then 2 kilometers. It seems about right. There's 2 to 3 kilometer advance. Now, I'll say fucking idiots who go, yeah, but a 2 or 3 kilometer advance means that it's going to take 3 years to get to Kyiv or 3 years to get to Beb. Warfare is not linear. It can grind to a halt, or it can then fall off a cliff and advance very quickly. Okay? Warfare is not linear at all. And in attritional war, it tends to actually speed up for the winning side if it can't be ground to a halt by then the military actions of both and attrition of both. Then we see around then Toretsk, we see more filling in the center, and as well out towards Dashne. We know Suryak showed that then the other day. We'll move up into Chasiv Yar, and we'll stay on Chasiv Yar south. Stopochki is the area we're looking for, still well outside of grey zone here, but Suryak is saying that Russian army had made new advances in the village, so they're saying they're right out in this area occupying then Stopochki. Let's go into the north, Hirovkia. We can see where this canal runs. Good area to line up. Look at this forest area as well, that this area is coming under control of the Russian forces, according to Suryak. Now, we'll come up into Terni. We know this is where Russia, I believe, probably over the last month has made the most kilometre squares, has been in this direction here. And if we then bring this up, Suryak is saying that there are further advances and that Russia is enveloping Novye, which is confirmed on the southern side by Deep State, but he's suggesting on the northern side as well, down into where this intersection is, as well as further on the south and eastern side, and significant advances in the north. So what we can see is where the grey zone is here, near this Novomikhailivka, that this is this town, but it's coming more further north of here. So this is this tree line where my cursor is, lining up to just below that. So as close as I can from here to here, that Suryak is suggesting there's about a 3 kilometre further advancement in this area, but no real changes shown on this map. As I've said, I believe this area Russia is trying to push very difficult, because if they can get within 10 kilometres of where the Oskil Zove is, so out to about here, if they can get to Lake Karpivka, getting Ukrainian forces up into this area is going to be very, very dangerous for FPV drones, HIMARS, artillery, MLRS systems, all of that, and we could see this whole area here very quickly come back under control and then further thin out the forces, because you'll have a natural barrier of the Oskil. Remember, military movements are small little bits and pieces to fit into a grander strategy that uses environment for its benefit. Okay, so let's talk about this ugly deal, and this will be the last bit we go over. So this is from Politico. It's talking about US peace framework, and what the US has suggested, they say, is hardly the peace through strength strategy that Trump increasingly sidelined Special Envoy Ukraine Keith Kellogg that he had outlined. We tell the Ukrainians, you've got to come to the table, and if you don't come to the table, support from the US will dry up. And you to tell Putin he's got to come to the table, and if you don't come to the table, then we'll give Ukrainians everything they need to kill you in the field. Now, realistically, it's looking like US will likely just more walk away than give more. It would just be so unpopular with their voters to want to sign off in their hundreds of billions of dollars more. But this peace through strength strategy, it never was really a strategy. It was something that people liked to chant, but what was actually being done to do that? Like, what was actually being put in motion for peace through strength, other than 5-point victory plans, 10-point peace plans that cost probably billions of dollars for, mad fucking parties in the Swiss Alps that now have been just completely forgotten about, like the Yes to Parliament vote in Australia. Now, but only half of that equation was put into effect. Ukraine is the only party making concessions. Furthermore, this will mark the first time in post-war history, I'm guessing World War II, that European borders will be redrawn by force of arms. That is incorrect. Turkey, Cyprus, Yugoslav wars, okay? But the thing is with this, is the only party making concession? No. With what the US is putting forward, there are concessions on Russia, or less concessions than are on Ukraine. And if you were someone seeing this objectively, you would go, yeah, the winning party is going to make less concession than the party that is currently losing. And if you want to change that, then you need to flip that to be in the position of power that Europe want them to be in. But what's being done to do that, or what actually can be done to do that too? Trump aides do have a point. However, when they argue it's been clear Ukraine would have to cede some territory, the column had argued the war was unwinnable for Ukraine for the past 2 years and has been critical of the West's promises to stick with Ukraine until the 1991 borders are restored. And I agree with that. I think Mr. Mearsheimer and others are correct when they said at the end of 22, that was the high water line to get the best bang for buck given the situation of the war, that from here it's going to deteriorate, and how badly will it deteriorate? This was, of course, a moment when this might not have been the case. There was, of course, so. If the West hadn't dithered at the start of the war, Russian troops could have been defeated and expelled from Ukraine back in 2022. This is from a Russian diplomat. Now, again, we don't know. Foresight is the hindsight of arseholes. Things may have gone vastly different, but I don't believe they would have been defeated and expelled militarily. But I think at that point in the war wasn't as existential for Russia as it has become now, with the amount of losses and expense. And the cost ratio of it may not have been worth it, and they would have pulled back, not to 1991 borders, but potentially back to 14 borders. But once the West chose to be afraid, as long as it takes mantra was always suspect. Yeah, as was the frequent assertion that no one should push Ukraine into talks. Whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And it wasn't only no one should push them, but it was we should, if they want to, we should pull them away from doing it. The promise of NATO membership was a folly, as it was clear Moscow would never allow that to happen. And the thing was, there were carrots dangled, and I think in time more people will become highly critical of this. Far too much hope was placed in economic sanctions, which were never likely to bring Russia to heel. Well, we heard that it was going to absolutely collapse it, and we said. So we reported that we had seen other leaders saying Russia is on the verge of collapse from these 3 years ago. But attritional war has always favoured Russia. Yes, it will favour the larger side, and the way Russia fight, the way their industry works, yes, especially as there was no chance Western allies would enter the war as combatants. In short, an ugly deal was predictable. If you run down your military force and arms productions for decades, fail to draw enforceable red lines, and don't ask hard questions before making promises, this is what happens. And a lot of this was never asked of. Are we really prepared for Ukraine to be in NATO? Are we really prepared to give what is needed? And this is where Trump, this is like in the beginning of where I said Trump is sitting, is he's going that this is what we saw as predictable. And if we just continue this and attrition war favours, it's going to get worse. And if we come to the table in 6 months or 12 months or 3 years from now, it's very likely, highly likely going to be in a significantly worse spot. This means Putin's thuggishness will be rewarded. There will be no accountability for his army's atrocious behaviour, for the unlawful, detestable deportations to Russia from occupied parts of Ukraine. Additionally, the axis of autocrats will be emboldened in their determination to smash the old global order. And we are in a shifting of global orders, whether we like it or not. We just don't know how it is really going to look at the end. But Trump has definitely sped this along with his tariffs and where people are seeing global orders and alliances shift. Absolutely. But yeah, after war like this, and look back at wars and see those who have really been held accountable for their actions, sadly, I wish more people were held accountable for actions. But in war, realistically, what we see is not that. Look at the Japanese, Iraqis, Americans, Australians, Brits. It's devastating, I agree. More devastatingly, it also means Ukraine will be the punished party, not Russia. And without a US-backed security guarantee, the ceasefire deal will be as worthless as the notorious 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which fixed Ukraine's borders and underwrote its sovereignty in exchange for the country relinquishing its Soviet-era nuclear arsenal. Now, a few things I push back on here. One, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. They were not Ukrainian nuclear weapons or operable from Ukraine, as well as the Budapest Memorandum. Even the Minsk agreements, the people really playing ball in these, it was broken and it was never going to last. And I think many people, as they point out in this, saw that it was just not going to last, and tensions are raised. And tensions get raised on purpose for then political wills and extending of nations also. Without security guarantees and a firm porcupine strategy, so porcupine strategy is that you can be attacked, but it makes it very difficult and incredibly costly, mainly through, say, like asymmetrical style warfare, to make sure Ukraine will be heavily armed and even more dangerous to mess with. There's a trick here too. The deal will likely spell the end of Zelensky's presidency and throw Ukraine into a political turmoil over the deal, as ceding territory will likely require constitutional amendment and a referendum. Putin will then have plenty of opportunity to exploit these political divisions, making the deal just a way station for his revanchist bid to subjugate the country, revanchist, a recovery of territory you believe you have. We see a complete unit in Ukraine named Revanche. Now, I've stated before, this political turmoil, I think, will really threaten Ukraine's ability to join EU or any other of those sort of coalitions. But increased tensions, the anti-US rhetoric that we see will be absolutely ripe for intelligence agencies to exploit. And I believe that we will likely see then some like over-the-top pro-Ukrainian Twitter accounts, like ultra-NAFO accounts, go that far in the anti-West behaviour that it's actually changing that, and that, if you were to trace it right back, is likely an intelligence bot from then Russia, because that will exploit that for that anti-Western rhetoric. Now, of course, some of it is just indigenous people not liking that. It's indigenous to the platform. But I believe, I still, with the ridiculousness of some of these Twitter pages, there's a bit of me that thinks, is this actually like a Russian intel op to really undermine this side as well and exploit people and make people get turned away from it? I think we'll see more of that. I think we will see a lot of exploitation of this rhetoric, especially if the guns fall silent in a peace that is not in Ukraine's favour. If Ukraine does spiral into political turmoil, what is Europe really willing to do? Not say, what are they really willing to do at that point? Because it could happen. And if Zelensky just doesn't play ball with the US, well, we have seen just over a decade ago, then a change of leadership in Ukraine to be more pro-West as well. The US and other nations, it's not above them to, put in other players in which they see align with their world order. So again, we will see, but an ugly deal is probably, I believe an ugly deal is the best case scenario. I believe the worst case scenario is that the attritional war continues and Russia and Ukraine are really threatening their futures. And the threat is Russia becomes more and more reliant on China, and that Ukraine end up becoming into a state of which a partnership like the EU can't accept it. So we will see. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, actually, I probably won't speak to you tomorrow, but I do actually have something else coming for you. So at this point of the video, watch out for that. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.